everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on HUD Systems. Our presenter today is Jenny DeSalva from Blueprint Housing Solutions, and Jenny will be directing today's webinar. A few housekeeping reminders, just to let you know that everyone on the webinar is muted. During the webinar question and answer section, if you would like to ask a question, you feel free to raise your hand and we will take you off mute and you can ask your question that way, or you can put your question in the questions box and we will read them off to Jenny. Now I would like to introduce Jenny DeSalvo to start our webinar.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, depending on what time zone you're in. As Kim mentioned, my name is Jenny DeSalva, and I work with Blueprint Housing Solutions. I think I've had the opportunity to have at least one or a few conversations with several of you as you are initiating your Secure Systems access for your PRA 811 contract. But what we want to be able to do in today's webinar is really kind of go through the chronological steps for some of you that are perhaps just initiating systems access. I think everyone will quickly learn that the Secure Systems setup is a little finicky. And if you don't do certain steps in the right order, you can get a little frustrated. So what we want to provide you with are some resources that will enable you to complete the steps kind of methodically so that you can get the right access to the right systems in order to administer your contracts. And I think most of us on the line are probably visual learners. So this interactive webinar is designed in such a way that we want to actually show you the screenshots that you will see as you are setting up your systems access. That way, when you go and do this live, you'll know that you're on the right track. In addition to talking about completing the steps for Secure Systems, we're also going to touch briefly at the beginning of the class on the other important administrative steps for the grantees, to include making sure that your direct deposit instructions are set up appropriately, and then making sure that the coordination occurs between the grantee level staff and the PRA staff in terms of executing RACs as you engage with your participating owners. Throughout the session, if you want, you can utilize either the chat box or the questions box in order to pose questions. And to the extent possible, I will try and address those questions in the context that they're being asked. That way we don't have to kind of go back 20 minutes and try and remember what it was, that we were talking about when the question was posed. So please feel free to type those questions. You can also raise your hand, and Kim will be monitoring that dashboard so that we'll know if there are questions in queue. Okay, so with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. I have tried to create the systems guide for you in such a way that this session will enable you to kind of watch what we're doing on the screen. I don't want anyone to have to be taking crazy notes, because then you're just a scribe and you're not necessarily able to process or think about what it is we're saying. So hopefully everyone has their systems grantee guide, the PDF. It is available as a handout on the dashboard that you can print. We also have the slides for today's session available as a PDF to print. And the information, I've tried to make the slides as comprehensive and as helpful as possible so that these can be a standalone reference to you after the session. That way you can watch and get a visual of what this is going to look like, and hopefully walk away with a better sense of understanding and some confidence that, that you can get your setup right. Okay, so with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. The first thing that we want to talk about as we are seeing more and more grantees obviously executing what we call racks is making sure that everybody understands kind of the nomenclature or the format that's being used for the parent level contracts and then the subsequent child contracts. So one of the ways to know whether you're seeing the right stuff in the systems, once, like especially once we start getting into, you know, the Trax system and whatnot, is the parent contracts are always going to have the same type of format. And I've shown that to you on the screen, where the format of the contract number is always going to start with a state 2-digit abbreviation, followed by whatever field office you're associated with. And then you will see the RDD, followed by the fiscal year for your award. And then the sequential numbering will start. So the parent contract is always going to end with an 01. And then the first child rack that's executed will follow as an 02, 03, 04, and so on. That will help you know whether or not you have any missing child contracts in the available contracts that you're trying to look at as we get into the Trax screens a little bit. So it's important that once you've signed your cooperative agreement with the PRA staff, that you go ahead and understand that Katina and Marvis and that team will establish that parent level contract with the Trax team. So they will initiate the assignment of the parent contract for you. Okay? Any questions? Anybody want to raise their hand if they have any questions about the nomenclature or the format of the contracts themselves? I don't think I see any hands raised. Okay, so then we are going to go ahead and keep going. Once you have your parent contract assigned to you, HUD staff is going to send your cooperative agreement to the Fort Worth accounting office. And that is how they basically allocate your grant funds to that parent contract in HUD's disbursement system, which is called ELOC. And that's basically just a bank account associated for the funds that are obligated to your particular state grant. When the vouchering starts, the grantees are going to always transmit vouchers to the Trax level, and that initiates kind of the funding request through ELOCs once that voucher is approved. And once the voucher gets approved, funds will come from the ELOC system, but they need to know where they're supposed to send the funds to. And that's why the direct deposit setup needs to be done very early in the process. That way, you know, once you start vouchering for your parent contracts and those vouchers are approved, the system is going to know where to send the funds. So when you are setting up your direct deposit, there are a couple of different options in terms of how you want to set this up. You are required to have a separate account for your PRA 811 grant funds. That's part of your agreement with HUD. However, whether you have a separate account for your funds that are ultimately going to your participating owners versus a fund that holds both your admin fees and your participating owner fees. There's a little bit of discretion there at the state level. My recommendation to you, just based on my experience as a former PBCA and having a lot of money coming in from admin fees and a lot of money coming in for HAP disbursements, I think it's cleaner accounting-wise for you to have a separate account for admin fees and a separate account for HAP disbursements. That way you know you're always dispersing out the same amount of HAP that you're getting deposited from ELOCs. But that has to be kind of an internal discussion that each grant level staff can have. If you wanted to have a single account, you would just have to be able to show that you have individual ledgers for the admin fees and individual ledgers for each of your participating owners. Now, obviously, the more owners you have, the more complex the layering on your general ledgers might be. So that's something to consider when you are setting up your direct deposit. If you need to go ahead and send the direct deposit and you have not done so already, I have provided here on the screen the address that you would need to send that direct deposit to. Now, right now, we're not in the middle of fiscal year end, but you would want to time this appropriately so that ideally you're not trying to get a direct deposit processed and rushed through in the month of October, particularly because fiscal year accounting requires that the Fort Worth accounting office actually shuts down for a couple of weeks and does year end. So you don't want to get your direct deposit kind of stuck in queue at that time. So just think about that when you're planning ahead on where you think you're going to be about the month of October of every year and try and avoid that. So if in doubt, go ahead and send that early, and there's no harm in getting that set up well in advance, and it would be encouraged. Okay. Any questions on that direct deposit setup? Okay. So then we want to talk a little bit about documenting the execution of your new RAC. If you want to follow along on the grantee guide, I'm on page 5 of that guide. Every time you need to request a new RAC, you're going to do that through the PRA Contracts email address at the HUD office, and there's a specific form to request a new RAC. And in that situation, the grantee needs to actually submit the child level contract, or that RAC, as well as the executed rent schedule, and there's a checklist that's associated with that, and all of those need to be sent to the PRA Contracts email address. That will facilitate the HUD staff actually entering in the rents, the unit allocations, and if there are utility allowances, they will have to enter those in on the back end of the Trax system. You as the grantee will not have the ability to enter those rents in from your end. So that has to occur at the HUD level. So it's real important that you get them that information so that Trax has those rents and unit mixes established for the child contract before you start transmitting your vouchers or your 5/9s directly to Trax. So we've got the direct deposit set up, and we've got the process in place for the RAC submission to the HUD office. The majority of this particular session, we're going to be talking about how you actually gain access to the right systems that you're going to need in order to administer your contract. I do see that I have just a couple of questions. Kim, do you want to stop and I'll go ahead and answer these questions now?
Sure.
Okay. So one question from a participant is if a state has both a fiscal year in 12 and a 13 grantee, do we need two separate accounts for the direct deposit? I believe in the cooperative agreement, it specifies that you need to have a segregated account for each award. Liz, do you know anything different about that, or is it safe to say that they should segregate those accounts?
Well, I'll double check, but I actually think my understanding in the cooperative agreement language says that you have to account for the grant funds separately. But I don't know, I don't think that necessarily means they have to be separate accounts, but you would have to have a way to be able to track the FY13 versus the FY12, because as you all know, there's different expenditure deadlines for each of those grants. So we'll do some homework, but my understanding is it's more of ensuring that you have a way of tracking the funds, separately accounting for the funds. That doesn't necessarily mean they have to be separate accounts. But I will get some additional information and make sure to send a follow-up once I get confirmation of that.
Okay. I think some people would argue that from a logistical standpoint, it may be easier to have separate accounts, maybe within the same, financial institution, but it might make the accounting a little easier if you have separate accounts. But we'll check on that and let everyone know. Another question that I've got is, does the grantee have to execute the rent schedule? Would HUD have an issue leaving those unexecuted? I'll go out on a limb here and correct me if I'm wrong, Liz, but I would say yes, the 92-458s, which are those rent schedule forms, that those would have to be executed, because without that execution signature on the second page, there's no way of defining that those were in fact the correct rents and the correct unit allocations that were approved. So I'm not sure I see the benefit of not executing those. I think it just may create a little bit more confusion, and you might end up with several different versions of rent schedules floating around. So I would say I would execute them. When I know this is a little bit different of a program, but when you're doing that from a contract administration standpoint on other HUD multifamily programs, the CA or the contract administrator, which is equivalent to the grantee in this case, does execute all of the rent schedules, and in the absence of that signature, it's not considered formally approved. Okay. All right, so when we're talking about gaining access to the individual subsystems, I first want to just make sure that everyone kind of understands in layman terms what each of these subsystems do for us as the grantee and what they do for owners when they have access to them. Those of us that have been in the industry for a while, we're accustomed to the acronyms and the verbiage that's used to describe these, but if you are new to secure systems, these acronyms don't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. So I just want to spend just a couple of minutes telling you about the systems that you're going to need access to. So there are many other types of systems in secure systems that we're not going to talk about today because they aren't directly related to the administration of the PRA 811 contract. But the ones that are going to be meaningful for us as grantees is IMAX, Trax, EIV, ELOCs, and IREMs. Of these 5, 3 of them can actually be viewable by your participating owners as well. However, the last 2, ELOCs and IREMs, access to those systems is restricted to either grantees, contract administrators, or HUD staff, and so your owners are not going to have access to ELOCs and IREMs, and that's kind of important to distinguish because as you're communicating with them about what you see or don't see in systems, it's always important to understand that you have access to some information that they can't view no matter what their rights are in secure systems. So just kind of keep that in mind. So the very first one that we want to talk about is Trax. And Trax is often used incorrectly in discussions when people talk about sending things through Trax. Well, Trax is actually where things end up, and it's really this very rather unsophisticated, large database of tenant data and voucher data that lives on giant servers up at HUD headquarters. And so it's what we refer to as the final repository database. So this is where everything that you transmit through IMAX ends up when it doesn't have any errors. And it's going to have both tenant information that's from your 5.9s, as well as voucher information that ultimately goes to ELOCs for disbursement. The mechanism for things making it into Trax is actually what we call IMAX. I don't know why my IMAX screen is not showing here. I might have it out of order here. Hold on just a second. I'm going to pause my screen. I might have that slide hidden. Just give me just a second. Okay, here we go. So IMAX is really the system or the highway that the certs that are coming to you as the grantee that you are validating and checking for errors and then sending those certs and those vouchers onto Trax. The mechanism of delivery is called IMAX, and I just kind of refer to it as the file highway, or kind of the circulatory system of how the certs and vouchers are making its way up to the Trax system. So think about that when you are using, when your owners are using software to create 5.9s and child vouchers. They upload them through IMAX to send them to you. You, in turn, download them into what we call your contract administrator software. And then you use your software to read the files, validate the files, check them for errors. And then when you're ready to send those files as the grantee up to Trax, you upload them into IMAX again, and they end up at Trax production, which is that repository database. Okay, so this is the mechanism of delivery, whereas the final place it lands is actually going to be the Trax database. You're going to want to have access to the Trax database so that you know that the files that you are sending are making their way up to Trax and are processing in the nightly batches for Trax successfully, because that's going to ultimately dictate the integrity of your tenant data making it to Trax. And if that integrity falls short and gets less and less accurate every month, then you could ultimately have some voucher funding delays based on what we call Trax compliance percentages. We won't get into that today, but it just reinforces there's a reason we want you to have access to this system, and it is so that you can be reassured that the files that you're sending into the black hole are actually making it into the Trax database to support the payments that you're going to be making to these owners. The next system is probably the hardest system to navigate through and perhaps to understand its purpose. It's a fairly new system for HUD in terms of tenure. It's been used in the multifamily arena since January of 2010. So we're 8 years into the implementation and mandatory use of EIV, and that includes for your participating owners in this program. But it's hard to understand sometimes what the EIV system is doing. So this is going to be one of the systems that both owners as well as grantees are going to need access to. And you'll see later in the session that the setup steps to gain access to EIV are more complex than the other systems. It's a little more time consuming. It has a little bit more security protocol involved in it, and I'll explain why that is in a minute. But this particular system is a mechanism for HUD, the Social Security Administration, and Health and Human Services to kind of reconcile what they have in their systems to identify wages, unemployment, and Social Security benefits for the individuals that are living in HUD multifamily housing programs. So this particular system interacts on a regular basis with both Trax, Social Security Administration's database, and what we call new hire state wage databases with HHS. And they basically swap and compare notes for individuals who live in assisted housing and spit out reports in EIV so that you can establish whether the residents that are living in your units are reporting all of their income sources that are specific to these categories. EIV doesn't see all types of data, only those three categories that I've mentioned. Grantees and owners alike will need to have access to the EIV system because this information is required to be incorporated into the recertification process at the site level, as well as shortly after someone's moved in, owners are obligated to go in and check the information on their newly established residents. And as grantees, once you have your monitoring mechanisms in place for making sure that your owners are using EIV appropriately, there are reports in the EIV system that you as grantees can look at to make sure that sites are going in and looking at their data and they have users whose access isn't terminated, and et cetera. And you will be able to tell based on the review of the reports if the owner is utilizing the EIV system appropriately. Okay. The last system is ELOC, and it stands for the Electronic Line of Credit Control System, and it is HUD's way of dispersing funds electronically through what we call ACH files that are direct deposited into the recipient's accounts. So HUD doesn't send out, paper checks anymore or anything like that. It's all handled electronically through ELOC. And this system is where your direct deposit information is going to be stored in terms of routing instructions, so that when you start either doing drawdowns on your admin fees or dispersing HAP payments, it's going to send to whatever bank account is on record from the Fort Worth office via the direct deposit that you submitted. Okay. So I do have a question from a grantee that indicated my agency is actually contracted with the PBCA to navigate through the HUD systems. And 8 months into managing the 811, I'm one of the 2 coordinators at my agency for secure systems, but I'm still not set up with access to some specific functionality. Is there really a need for me to press for this setup? I would say, on a day-to-day basis, if you've contracted with a PBCA, they are likely handling the reconciliation of their data and their software to Trax. But from a quality control perspective, I think you, as the ultimate grantee for the program, you need to decide, how much oversight would you want to have in terms of that PBCA entity. So I think that's an internal decision that you need to make to decide how closely you want to watch what the PBCA is doing. So Trax, maybe not so much, maybe ELOC, you might obviously want to, have a little bit more control over that because you're going to be doing drawdowns. But I think that really is something that you guys kind of have to decide how much systems oversight you want, or if you want them to generate reports and send them to you on a regular basis. So I also have someone that's asking, we're still waiting on HUD to approve our ELOC authorization. Will that affect the ability to receive direct deposits for monthly vouchers? ELOC authorization for you to actually see ELOC is one step. Having the direct deposit entered in might actually occur before you get screens access. So if you have verified with the Fort Worth accounting office that your direct deposit information is in there, your inability to see ELOC isn't going to necessarily prevent disbursements. However, there is a step in ELOC that each grantee needs to take to kind of tell HUD that they're the recipient now. So let me get to that screen, and I will definitely tell you what that is. It's related to a field that we call the cutover date, but we'll get to that in just a second. Okay, so this was meant to just really kind of give you an overview of, in layman's terms, what these particular systems are designed to do in order for you to facilitate the program. The last system is a system owners are not going to have access to, and some of it is really a viewable database for you as grantees. There are some specific tasks where you would enter what we call project actions into IREMS, but a lot of it is data that is entered into at the field office level or at the headquarters level directly by HUD staff, and we can view the screens. So IREMS is really meant to be a database of information for the insured and assisted properties, it contains information in terms of the ownership for the property and the management agent for the property, the financing and the particular, type of structure of their financing, whether they're HUD held, what section of the act or whatnot certain properties are. It is not something that an owner can go in and say, oh, that's the wrong information on that screen, I'm going to update it. There's a lot of control over what gets put into IREMS, and 90% of it's done by HUD staff. This is the system where grantees would be entering in project actions in the event you would do something that's kind of equivalent to a management and occupancy review. I know that several grantees aren't at that point yet where they're doing any kind of formal monitoring of the participating owners. But once PRA staff kind of outline that procedure for you and initiate those type of tasks, that would be where you would enter in, the outcome of a monitoring visit for your owner through a management and occupancy review. This is also the system where grantees will be able to enter in project actions for rent adjustments and contract renewals. There have been some hiccups very early on the process in terms of getting the Secure Systems network to kind of understand that PRA 811 is a new program. And so as far as I know, for right now, most grantees are not able to enter in their project actions for rent adjustments and contract renewals right now, and they're sending that information to the PRA staff, and they are doing it on your behalf. That's just a systems limitation with IREMS really kind of acknowledging this as a new program, and that hasn't quite been worked out yet. So until you hear differently, when you have new rents to enter in, new renewals, new rent schedules, those need to go to the PRA staff for entry, and then they will appear viewable in IREMS for the grantee. Okay, so let's pretend that you are a brand new grantee, that you've never worked in Secure Systems before, and you're at the very, first step in this process in terms of beginning your relationship with Secure Systems. If that is the case and you've never done work with HUD previously through this system, you're going to have to start at the very beginning through the app's homepage. And I've given you the link here. It is also in the grantee guide on page 6. And you'll just actually hit these little hyperlinks in order to register as a business partner. So this is just where you're going in and saying, hey, HUD, we're going to start doing business. You're going to start sending me money, and I need to establish myself as a business partner for you. When you click on that link, you're going to enter in the tax ID number that was associated with your cooperative agreement. And I believe that cooperative agreement tax ID number is on page 2 of the cooperative agreement. I might have my page number wrong there, but I've worked with several grantees on this step thus far, and there has been some confusion when the cooperative agreements are executed, which TIN number is to be used, because your entity might have multiple TIN numbers established for business purposes already. So it's just really critical that whichever one you guys decide to put on the cooperative agreement, that needs to be the one that you stick with throughout this program, because swapping out the TINs really confuses not only the players involved, but definitely the systems, and it creates a lot of disconnect and unsuccessful attempts to see things in the system. So be absolutely sure when you establish your business partner relationship with HUD that you know you're using the correct 10 associated with your cooperative agreement. And you're actually just going to enter it in to the blank here that's got the 10 identification without dashes. When you submit that online form, if you're already established, you're going to get a message that says you're already an established business owner. And then you know you're not going to have to complete this process. You've already got a 10 out there that's been registered. If not, the screen that's on the PowerPoint right now is going to be what shows, and you need to put the legal entity name for the grantee entity that's associated with a 10. It really needs to match that which is on your cooperative agreement. And most of the little drop-down menus are self-explanatory in terms of your ownership, your legal structure. Your address here needs to be correct. This is going to be the address that gets some very important information later on in the setup process. So you need to make sure that you're putting in an address here that can receive physical mail. I would discourage PO boxes being entered here. It's really going to be important that you put in a physical address where there are people physically there. There's a mail receptacle that's going to be able to receive mail, because you're going to get some activation key codes at this address. The rest of the contact information is pretty self-explanatory. After you've completed it, you'll go ahead and hit that Save button. And then once you have entered this in, you need to wait overnight. That will process, and that relationship will establish within 24 hours. And then your 10 will be in the Secure Systems database as a registered business partner. So you can't take this step and then immediately go on to the next one. You got to take at least a one-night break. And your next step is going to be, internally, you all need to decide who's going to be the coordinator at your entity and who's going to be the users. The users are the ones that are likely going to be going into the system on a regular basis to perform tasks. Coordinators might be a little more removed from those daily tasks. Most of those are at more of a supervisory level. And I strongly recommend that you have at least 2 coordinators for your entity. God forbid something were to happen to one of the coordinators, but if you run out of coordinators and all you've got left are users, then you're in a little bit of a pickle getting your systems access, because eventually your coordinator's access is going to terminate, and then you're basically locked out of the system. So for backup purposes, make sure that you have at least 2 Secure Systems coordinators established at your entity. And in order for them to become a coordinator, they are going to need to register as a Secure Systems coordinator using the link that I've provided on the screen. This is also going to be available to you in the guide. Once you click on this link, if you look at page 9 of the guide, you're going to see this user coordinator and user registration form. The same form that's completed online is done for coordinators and users, but obviously coordinators need to do this first because everything is, at initial setup, everything's going to go to the coordinator. So you've got to get your coordinators established first. Self-explanatory, first, middle, last name, social. They do ask for whether you're an organization or an individual. And you get to establish your own password in this case. But in order to get set up as the coordinator first, you're going to fill out this form and enter in an address. Your email address is where you're going to get notified that you've been approved as a coordinator. This happens fairly quickly. You can submit this online, and it happens. It's pretty fault-free. I haven't had any hiccups with this particular process. Any questions so far on requesting coordinator access to get the ball rolling here? Okay. On the bottom half of the screen, you'll see that you select a password. You're the only one that knows that password, so you need to write it down because you're not going to be able to call someone and say, hey, I can't remember what my password is. You can reset it, but you establish that. And you also have to fill in, just for security purposes, your mother's maiden name. They will ask for that in the event you ever need to reset your password for just security protocol. So you send that application through, and you get notification fairly quickly. I've mentioned you establish your password. If at any point down the road you've forgotten what your Secure Systems password is, because in this day and age we probably all have 10 different sets of different logins to different systems. But if you need to reset your password, there is an online functionality that you can do that as well. And it resets it in about 45 seconds and gives you an email with your new password. So I've also provided you, just in case you need it in the future, the reset password link that can be done online. That is only going to work for you as long as you continue using the same email address that you originally used when you registered. If you swap emails, it's not going to know to send it to your new email unless you've updated that in Secure Systems. So just be aware if you change your domain name or anything like that on your email, this is only going to go to the one that is linked to your registration. Okay. Once you have received a notification through your email that you've been issued what's called a WAS ID, W-A-S-S, this is also used just in everyday language. People will refer to that as your MID, M as in monkey, and that is because every person who uses Secure Systems as a multifamily user is going to have a WAS ID that starts with an M. And it's usually going to be M followed by 2 alpha characters, and then the remainder of your user ID is numeric. User IDs are cap sensitive, so you always capitalize the M alpha alpha. If you try and do it lowercase, you're going to get locked out and it's not going to accept it. So always keep your MID capitalized along with the password that you established when you registered. On occasion, you're going to have to update your password. I think it's usually every 90 days. You have to update that password and keep track because it will not let you use passwords that you've historically used, like within the last 8 cycles, I think it is. So every once in a while, you have to get more and more creative with your password there. You will go to this login screen when you actually go into Secure Systems. If you want to get a shortcut to just go straight to this login screen from your browsers, you can always just Google HUD external login. And if you make HUD external login, your Google search, it'll take you directly to this login stage, and you're not going to have to go and click 14 times into the HUD home website in order to get to that. So if that's easier for you to set up as a favorite, you're going to want to have it as a favorite because you're going to access the system on a regular basis. Once you log in with your user ID, your WAS ID, and your password, you're always, the very first time that you log in, you're actually going to get the rules of behavior, which you have to read through and accept. That just indicates you're going to respect the Privacy Act protected information that's contained in the system, and that you will not disclose it to unauthorized individuals, and that you'll secure the data, et cetera, et cetera. I think those of us that have worked in HUD multifamily systems are pretty familiar with the security protocol for the information that we have available on our tenants. So you will accept the rules of behavior. You will not do that every time. That's just the very first time that you get into the secure systems setup. After that, it knows that you've accepted those rules. And this is what your main menu is going to look like. Now, this is actually a redacted version of my login, and so you may not have all of these systems, and that's okay. But the systems that you're going to want to gain access to are going to be listed up here at the top. You're going to want to see Trax, IREMS, IMAX, and EIV. If you are a coordinator, you will see system administration rights that also allow you to give assignments to your users. So if you are a user only, you're only going to see user maintenance, but if you're a coordinator, you're going to see these other options like participant assignment, business partner maintenance, assistant contract maintenance. But this is just the general main menu login. So this is a quick way of making sure that you have access to all of the systems, because if you do not have access to the appropriate subsystems, they're obviously not going to show in your main menu, and you're going to know those are the ones that you need to troubleshoot and get your access to. Any questions so far on systems access? Okay. Once you've gotten into secure systems, as a new coordinator, you need to then basically tell HUD Systems, I'm working for the grantee. And in order to tell them that you are a coordinator for the grantee, you need to establish a business partner relationship with that grantee. So remember how you established the grantee as a business partner by entering in the 10 at the early process. You're going to do something very similar, linking your user ID to that business partner, and we call that business partner maintenance. So in order to do that, on your main, let me go back to the main menu, you're going to see this link here that says business partner maintenance. When you click on that, it's going to ask for you as the coordinator to enter in your MID in this field right here. And you're going to request new or delete existing. So leave it at the drop-down menu for request new. When you hit the submit button there, you're going to be given the option of entering in the 10 for your grantee entity. So again, this needs to be the same 10 that you entered into on your cooperative agreement, and you're linking your login to the grantee system so that you can see what the grantee is entitled to see. So all you're going to do is put in the 10 number here, and you're going to hit the submit button. And this is one of the few times in the setup system where once you've requested this, you kind of have to sit and wait for a little while, okay? So within 10 business days, I've actually seen it go a little bit more towards 14 here lately, but within 10 business days, HUD is going to send to the address that you put in apps a very generic letter that has a very important activation key code on it. And unfortunately, this letter is not going to say, "Dear John Smith, here's your activation key code." It's going to be template based. It's very non-specific. It'll be addressed to the grantee entity using the address that you put in apps, but it usually says something like "Attention President CEO." It doesn't name a particular person. That means that you kind of have to be on the lookout for this letter, or else whoever opens the mail at that physical address isn't going to know who was looking for this and where it's supposed to go. And sometimes these kind of get lost in the shuffle, and you don't want that to happen because the activation key code that's on that letter expires 14 days after it's been issued. So it's really important that when you're looking for these key codes, you have, touched base with whoever's opening the mail and saying, "Hey, when you see this, I need to get it pretty quick because the clock is ticking there." Once you get this cryptic letter with this, it looks like kind of like a really jumbled activation key code with a mixture of alphanumeric numbers, and it's like 28, 27 characters long or something in the middle of this letter. Then you have to take that letter, come back into the system, and enter in that activation key code. So you're going to go back in now as the coordinator. You've got your activation key code letter. You sign back into Secure Systems. And under business partner relationship, instead of requesting a new relationship, you're going to hit the drop-down menu to activate a relationship. And when you go to activate the relationship, it'll have the TIN number that you used to request it and the entity name. And in this field here is where you're going to key in the activation key code from that letter. And again, you have to do this within 14 days of receiving it. If you've let it expire and you've sat on that letter for too long, you're going to have to re-request a new activation key code and then start your 10-day waiting game over again, which can really stall out the process for you. So once you've entered in that activation key code and you hit the submit button, it will say, "You've established your business partner relationship. Thank you. Good job," or something to that effect. Okay. So now Secure Systems knows that you work for the grantee, and now you will be able to give yourself access to the subsystems that grantees get access to. That's a quick process for 4 of those systems. There are some additional steps that you have to take in order to gain access to the EIV system. So in order to gain access to EIV, you're going to have to do an additional authorization form again that is going to ask for some specific information for you so that they can go in and process. There's a little bit more of a manual process with EIV than it is with some of the others. And I think I've hit a slide again. So it looks like, give me just a second and I'm going to go back and unhide the slides because it jumped. Kim, are there any other questions as I'm unhiding that slide?
I don't see any new questions, and no one has their hand raised.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so we are back in business here. If you're following along on the guide, I am on page 16, where we're gonna put a placeholder for just a minute on the EIV system, because I want to show you some specific screens for that. I want to go ahead and do the quicker steps of showing you how to get access to IMAX, Trax, IREMs, and ELOCs, because it's an instantaneous authorization for you. So as the coordinator, to get systems access to each of those, you're going to go to, on the main screen, you're going to go to user maintenance. And when you click on user maintenance, it's going to give you the option to search by a user ID, and you're going to enter in your own MID and hit search for user. And it's going to pull you up. You're going to see your name. It's going to show that you're a coordinator. Your access is current. You're an active coordinator. And I think it gives the email address that the system has for you. Whenever you get to that screen, there is a drop-down menu, and you're going to select Maintain User Profiles. And this is how you get to toggle certain subsystems and assign yourself as a coordinator. And you're going to actually toggle. When I say toggle, it just enables you to click on a little box and a little check mark is going to show up. And you're going to actually toggle and make sure that you have systems access to all 4 of these systems that I have on the bottom of the screen here. So IMAX, Trax, IREMs, and ELOCs. Once you've got the coordinator role toggled for each of those, you're going to hit the Assign, Unassign button. And then I do believe it asks you to confirm. So this is what it looks like when you've got your MID. This is redacted out just so that I didn't show personal information here. But this is the drop-down menu that I'm talking about. So the first one you're going to do for the profiles, you hit submit, you hit confirm. Then you're going to repeat this step, except on the drop-down menus, you're just going to be selecting different options on the drop-down menu. So your second option is going to be Maintain User Profile Roles. And instead of it just being toggling the coordinator role on these, you're going to actually toggle some very specific roles that I have in the blue box on the screen here. Those same roles are going to also be displayed on page 17 of the materials in the systems guide. And you're basically telling the system you need roles in order to access IMAX, Trax, so that you can see the Trax certification coordinator, Trax certification or recertification. Those are 2 new roles in Trax. Trax tenant queries and Trax voucher query roles. That enables you to see both 5.9s and the status of your voucher submissions. IREMs has several different roles. You're going to want to pick the one that's called SCA for Supervisory Contract Administration role. And then ELOCs, you're going to want to see the query role. You don't necessarily need drawdown, or I think there's one for year end or something like that. You're just going to want to pick the query one for ELOCs. And then again, once you've toggled those roles, you'll just hit that Assign, Unassign button again, and then confirm your changes. So now you've given yourself the roles and the subsystems access. Now Secure Systems needs to know for what properties are you wanting to see this on? And so that's where your executed racks come in. Once you've started executing your racks, you're going to need to do what we call property assignment maintenance so that you can see the specific information on those sites based on that RAC's tax ID number, or you could also put in the contract number for the child contract here. So again, you'd go back to your main menu and you would see this property assignment maintenance option. It's pretty self-explanatory. You put in your user ID, you want to assign yourself to the property. You can either do the drop down on the menu and pick the tax ID number that's associated with the property, or you can put in the contract number and hit submit. You do not have to put in the individual row codes here. You can just hit submit. When you hit that submit button, you're going to actually see all of the things that are available to you. And that's going to show on this next screen. Let me go back. It's actually, I don't think I have it in here, but it's going to show some roles on the top of the screen and some properties on the bottom half of the screen. And this is the fourth bullet here is the one that you want to pay attention to the most. In order to select all of your available roles with all of your available properties, you're going to just highlight everything by keeping your control key down and just selecting everything until it gets highlighted. I think it highlights blue. Once you've got everything highlighted by hitting that control key, you hit submit, and voila, Secure Systems has got you access with those roles and those subsystems to each of the contracts that were available to you. Okay, I do have a question. Is the contract number for assigning properties in Secure Systems the PRA contract number? It is, just keep in mind, Jeff, that there's two contract numbers. There's the parent contract number, which is the one that's associated with you as the grantee. And then there are child contract numbers that are associated with the child vouchers or the child contracts for the RACs. So they're all going to have that same format on the contract number. I think it's 11 or 12 digits. Just remember your 1201 is your grantee, or your 1301 is your grantee number, whereas the ones that are 02, 03, 04 are your child contract numbers. Okay. All right, so now that you've completed those steps, you should be able to see everything that's in Secure Systems for those contracts in each of those subsystems, with the exception of EIV. In order to gain access to EIV, you actually have to do what's called a CAF, which is a Coordinator Access Authorization Form. And I've given that to you on an earlier slide. Let me just go back to that real quick. To gain access to EIV, there's a separate online form that you have to submit, and you submit it electronically. And you're basically telling multifamily EIV staff that you are the grantee for this program and you need contract administrator rights to gain access to EIV. When you submit that form, the link that I've given you is actually to a PDF. You fill out the PDF and you email it to the multifamily email address that's listed on the PDF form. So you can actually go to the form itself. It gives you the instructions on when to submit it, and you email it to multifamily. They will email you back the signature page that shows they've approved your CAF. They won't give you the whole form back, but they will email back the form, the page of the form that requires the multifamily signature page on it. And you're going to want to keep that handy to show that you have the appropriate security documents to gain access to EIV, because at some point when PRA staff initiate monitoring tasks for you, they might ask for your systems access information into EIV, just to make sure that you have followed security protocol for security awareness training and other elements that are involved with EIV. I'll be talking about some of those additional security elements at the convening in a couple of weeks, so I don't want to take time diving into that for this session, but just be aware that you submit the paper CAF through email. They reply back to you with a signature page, and that's their mechanism of telling you you've been assigned as the coordinator role on the contract administration level for EIV. At this point, once you've taken all of those steps, you should be able to go into EIV and look at the EIV information for the residents that are living in any of your RAC contracts. You should be able to go into the Trax system and see any certifications that you've transmitted via IMAX to Trax to make sure that they were processed to the production database successfully. You would be able to check the status of your submitted vouchers under voucher queries under the Trax system. And then you would be able to go in and see the individual contract details in IREMS for your child contracts and see when the PRA staff have entered in the allocations, the gross rents, the utility allowances and whatnot from rent schedules anytime there are rent adjustments or contract renewals. So I know that it seems kind of like a clunky kind of process, but once you've gotten the hang of it and you understand how the systems talk to each other, it actually makes a little bit of sense in the order that you complete the tasks. There's one final subsystem that you need access to, and many of you probably think this is the most important one because this is the one that sends you the money, and that is ELOCs. ELOCs access is not something that they hand out a lot, so you need to make sure that you really need access to ELOCs in order to have it. So that might be something that maybe the coordinators have access to at your entity, but you may not have all of your users necessarily that are going to need ELOCs access, just depending on what their role is in your company. But in order to gain ELOCs access, it's important that you understand there's a different process for you to gain ELOCs in order to tell the system that you need to start receiving the HAP funds. There's a separate process for if maybe you're in the accounting department or the finance department for your entity, and you're going to be in charge of monitoring the admin fee payments that are coming through into your bank accounts, your payments for being the grantee. If you are gaining access to ELOCs just for the sake of monitoring the contract administration aspects of it and entering what we call the cutover date, then I've given you a link to a user guide there, and I will also kind of show you what those steps are going to look like. These are similar steps for what someone in maybe, again, the finance department might do if they are needing to gain access to request the drawdowns on admin fees. This isn't quite as automated of a process. There is still an authorization form that needs to be completed for those that are requesting access to draw down admin fees, you need to complete what's called a HUD Form 27054. It's also referred to as the ELOC Access Authorization Form. It is available on HUD Clips, and in the systems guide, I think I do have it set up as a hyperlink so that you can hit your control button and click on it in the actual systems guide, and it'll take you directly to the form. That has to be completed manually, and it needs to be sent with a wet original signature to Katina, Washington, up at headquarters. So that is not something that you're going to be able to scan or email. They need to actually receive wet signatures on that. Historically, when people filled out that form several years ago, it had to be notarized. But as far as I can tell, Liz, do you know if Katina is still requiring the notary seal on those?
You know, I'm not sure. I mean, I know it's
okay.
It's now, so I could double check with her.
Okay. Just, I would hate for someone to like FedEx it to make sure it got to Katina right, and then she would say, no, it needs the notary. I know the form requires it to be notarized, but I don't know as if PRA staff are enforcing that. So we might want to check that before people are mailing that, or if anybody has mailed it to Katina previously, if they've already completed that step and didn't get it notarized, maybe they can send a chat or something and let us know if they're holding to that requirement or not, because that might make a difference in the in the timing there a little bit. So either way, there's no fancy upload or online submission for that. It actually needs to go through the mail or FedEx again to Katina. I think she prefers it being FedExed just to make sure that there's some tracking mechanisms there. In terms of completing that form itself, it's not necessarily intuitive the way the instructions are written. And so we have given you some specific tips on how to fill out certain fields of that form. Those instructions start on page 19 of the guide. And there's just some very particular ways that you have to notate and indicate on this form that this is for PRA 811 versus other program types. So when it asks for the new program area and whatnot, you need to put in 811A. And then again, the instructions do indicate that she would prefer that these get FedExed with original wet signature. If you're a new user entirely, then you just, instead of just telling them that you're just adding a program area, you would select that you're a new user and complete the form in its entirety. If you already have ELOC access, maybe if you're also the contract administrator for project-based Section 8 or something like that, you might just need to be amending your access to tell them you now need 811A access. But if you are a grantee that's never had ELOCs before, you're going to fill out that entire form.
Jenny, this is Liz. I just got confirmation that with the notary, that's only required if you're a new user. Okay.
So if you are amending your program area and you're adding 811 to your access, no notary. But if you are an entire new submission, never had ELOC access before, then you are required to get that form notarized prior to sending it with wet signature. Okay. Once Katina and her staff have approved your ELOC authorization access form, you are going to know it because when you go into Secure Systems, one, you're going to see ELOCs as an available subsystem for you on the main menu. When you click on that, what you're really looking for, the magic indicator that you've been approved for the necessary ELOCs access, is you're going to see this here on the very bottom. Now, we all know that this is not the Section 8 program, but they're piggybacking on the functionality of the system that's already in place for contract administrators there. So if you see S8 contract administrators, click here. That is the button that indicates that you have been given the appropriate access for ELOCs. You are never going to enter in a LOCS user ID and password. You're not going to need that for this particular program. And so don't confuse, this is not where you enter in an MID and your associated password there. You're going to leave it blank, and you're actually going to click on the little gray button that says S8CA only. When you click on that, you're going to see different program areas that you've been given access to. And what we're looking for, again, it's not perfect because we're piggybacking on existing infrastructure here, but it's going to say S8CA for the Section 8 Contract Administration level access. And then you're going to see here a line, and it's going to have a 2-digit state code and 802. This is what is referred to as your CAID. So for those of you that are PBCAs under Section 8, you're going to know your contract administrator ID is always going to be like TX800 or CA800 or TN800, whatever your state code is, and 800 was the series number for PBCAs for Section 8. For this particular program for PRA 811, they've established it as 802. So it's always going to be your state code plus 802. That's what you want to see when you get into ELOCs. It's saying you're seeing the ELOCs access information for the PRA grantee level for your state. And again, you'll see it as 802. Regardless of how many awards you have, whether you have fiscal year 12 or fiscal year 13 awards, your CAID is going to be the same. And it's always going to have that same nomenclature. You're getting very close to the end of setup process by the time you have access to ELOCs and you've been given access to the correct CAID. Your entity, if you've had other programs that you've worked in historically, maybe you've been a traditional contract administrator or something like that, you might have other program types, but the contract administration ID that's specific to this program is always going to be the 802. When you click on that, it's actually going to be a hyperlink. And when you click on that, it's going to give you a menu of some options within ELOCs. Some of them are not going to mean as much to you as others, but the most crucial one in your setup is going to be this one here that's called the cutover date. This is your way of telling HUD that this is the very first voucher that you're going to be submitting, and from that point on, anytime Trax gets a parent voucher under your parent contract number, that it's okay to send the funds to you so that you can disperse them. So anytime you have negotiated some of your racks and you're getting ready to submit your very first parent voucher to me for review, before it's going to get funded, you're going to need to enter in your cutover date here. You actually click on this, and what it does is it gives you an option to put in the cutover date in month, year format. So you would do, for example, 05/2018, if that was going to be the very first voucher that you sent as a parent voucher. HUD allows that to fluctuate, I think, 90 days. So don't send a cutover date too early and then stall out on your voucher submissions, because if it's outside of that 90-day window, ELOC isn't going to send you the money for it. But as long as you know definitively that you're going to be transmitting parent vouchers within the next 3 months, whatever the first month is in terms of your first planned voucher month for a parent voucher, you'll enter in that voucher and year. Once you enter that in, most of you will probably either be doing that in conjunction with some go-to meetings with me, or if you do it independently without my assistance, that's okay. But you're going to want to let the PRA staff know that you've entered in a cutover date, because they have to go into their system kind of through the back door and approve it for you. Once Katina and her staff have approved the voucher cutover date for you, that's basically kind of opening the gates in ELOCs, and they know that any voucher that is sent from that parent voucher after that date is going to be dispersed, and it's going to direct those funds to whatever account you had established in the direct deposit form. That's the final step necessary for you to start receiving your HAP disbursements. Once you've entered in your cutover date, you don't have to do that, every single time you execute a RAC. It's associated with your CAID, so it knows once you're the established grantee, then you're authorized to get those payments. So that's a one-time only type of setup. Okay. The last setup that needs to occur in order to do transmissions through IMAX is each of you as grantees needs to be established with what we call a Trax mail ID. It's also called an IMAX ID. They mean exactly the same thing. And that's basically the inbox for incoming transmissions. So if you are a grantee that is requiring the owners to have their own software and transmit to you, they're going to ask you what Trax mail ID they need to send their files to, and it's kind of like an email address within IMAX. So it's always going to show as TRACM followed by 5 numeric characters. That gets assigned to you by the Trax help desk. So if you have not received a Trax mail ID, I've given you the hyperlink to fill out the form where you tell the Trax help desk that you are a contract administrator that needs a Trax mail ID for the 811 PRA program, and they will issue you a unique Trax ID that is just for your entity, and your owners will know that that's the inbox that they need to send their files to when they're transmitting through IMAX. That is also, yet again, another field that's going to have a password. And once you establish the password, you're the only one that knows the password. So if you lose the password, it has to get reset, but the Trax help desk doesn't know what the password is. So they would just reset it for you every time. So reason number 475 to keep a secure list of your user IDs and passwords available to you, because you're gonna have several of them when this process is over with. So to keep them all straight, find a way to log them in a secure manner. Okay. That's probably way more technical information than you ever wanted to get in an hour and a half, but I hope you found it helpful. I want to open it up now to see if anyone has questions about the guide or about the slides that accompany the guide that we've provided in this session, or any kind of unique questions about your setup. If you're running into a really specific issue, I would say give me a call or email me and I can kind of troubleshoot that with you offline. But if there's any questions about kind of the overall process at a higher level or the order of steps, I'd be willing to ask or answer any of those questions that you guys might have. I think that I have answered the ones that have come through in queue on the typed questions.
There is one in there from Christy that you didn't get to. But other than that, no one has their hand raised, and there are no new questions. But Christy has a question in the chat box.
Okay, so Christy, you asked how many coordinators are you allowed to have? HUD would prefer that you have 2. From a contract administrator level, you can actually have up to 5. But the more coordinators that are involved, the more oversight obligations and those coordinators have. So I wouldn't hand it out like candy, but if you think you need 5, you could have up to 5. But most entities just have a couple. One who's really doing it and one who's kind of an emergency backup. But you get to decide that. The limit is 5 though. Any other questions from anyone? If we have a vendor that's processing voucher payments, can we still see 5 nines on IMAX? So I'm assuming, Wes, you've got a third-party contractor that's handling your transmissions for you. If you have a user ID and Trax access, then you can definitely see what's making it into the Trax system. If you have IMAX access, you could be given access to your contractor's IMAX ID and password and be able to see the files that they're uploading. Most grantees that outsource that probably don't necessarily want to monitor that because that's why they've paid the contractor to do it. But you can have as much access to that which has been given to your contractor as you want, just from an oversight perspective. But definitely you can track what's making it into Trax and the status of the voucher submissions if that's what your priority concern is looking at the vouchers that have coming in. Yeah, you can see that. It's not necessarily with IMAX, it's with Trax though. So you would just want to make sure you've got the Trax access to know when the vouchers are getting submitted and paid. When I'm talking about vouchers, the parent vouchers are the only ones that you're going to see in voucher queries. Child vouchers kind of die at the grantee level. Once an owner transmits a child voucher to the grantee, those child vouchers don't make it to Trax. They get rolled up in the parent voucher, and it is only the parent voucher that gets transmitted directly to the Trax production. Okay. Anyone else have any questions? All right, well, I show that we're ending exactly on time, but I am happy to answer any questions. If you have any follow-up questions, you're welcome to email me those. I do believe at the end of the session, I think I've given my contact information here on the screen. It's also on the last page of the guide. You're welcome to do any follow-up emails if you have other questions or situations we didn't get to touch on in this session. And hopefully I will see all of you at the convening on May 10th and 11th. Are those dates right, Liz? May 10th and May 11th?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. I will be there and will be available to troubleshoot with any of you that might still be having issues at that point.
Okay.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you, Jenny, for the good presentation.
You're welcome.
And we will be ending our webinar. Thank you all.